So it is my pleasure and my privilege to introduce Fabiola Rodríguez Váquez for her dissertation defense. Fabiola comes to us from Honduras. She did her undergraduate degree at the National University of Honduras, where she worked on birds, and she spent every opportunity during her degree and after her degree giving opportunities to work with birds, to be field assistants, and do banding courses in the US and elsewhere. And eventually she did a master's degree at Indiana University, where she worked perhaps in her life in general, as that of a connector, which I had a prettier word for it. But she chose for her PhD to study migratory birds. Migratory birds are a way in which we are deeply connected. The North America and South and Latin and Central America are deeply connected through migratory birds, which is what Fabiola she had mentored loads of people, lots of people in Honduras and beyond. Many of those people have learned R programming and GIS and field techniques through these interventions, and they've gone on to their own graduate programs. She was a member of the scientific committee for Aves Honduras, which is a group that brings people together around the topic of bird research and bird conservation in Honduras. She was a fellow for the Road to Recovery initiative, which is another group that brings people together around the issue of trying to reverse some of the declines in birds that we've seen over the last few years. In my lab, she was instrumental in helping us me and my collaborators write a grant that brings us, connects us, continues our connection with Honduras, working on sustainable coffee. The grant would not have happened without her. And so we formed these deep connections between Tulane, and Honduras, and between North America and Central America through Fabiola. I know that it's supposed to be the other way around, but I know that I am eternally grateful to Fabi for the opportunities that she's afforded me. And I know that I'm not alone in that feeling. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Fabiola.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank gracias, everyone on Zoom, for being here as well. I will be sharing with you the work that I have been doing for the last 6 years. In the back, can you hear me well? Great. Okay. So, okay. So my research is centered around animal migration ecology. And migration is a complex behavioral adaptation where individuals are tracking the resources that they need to survive. I focused in the Nearctic Neotropical migratory songbird system. And this system is encompassed by 152 species within the order of the songbirds, Misericordia. And I want to introduce the system with an example of a species so you can gain the context. So for a migratory songbird, there is a breeding phase, which in this case for the wood thrush, it's in Eastern North America, so that's the Arctic region. After the breeding phase, birds will have a post-breeding, also termed fall migration. And then birds settle in a relatively stationary, non-breeding or overwintering period in the Neotropics. After this, the cycle is closed with a pre-breeding or spring migration. So we can appreciate from this how complex it is to study migratory songbirds, not only in the science, but also in the context of geopolitical, cultural differences that we may encounter. For example, if you wanted to study a bird like the golden-winged warbler in the breeding grounds, maybe that study involves understanding the early successional forest and timber harvested regions of the eastern United States. If you're studying this species in the non-breeding grounds, maybe those studies will involve understanding the biology of montane forests of Nicaragua and Central America and understanding coffee production. So this system provides so many opportunities that fascinate researchers, but another motivator for research in this system is the observed population declines that have been recorded. So throughout my PhD, I have been exposed to this research question, which is what limits populations of migratory species? And it's a complex question, which I do not answer, but I definitely want to design a dissertation that would contribute to our understanding to this big question that drives us conservationists and ornithologists. So before I jump into designing and just this PhD journey, I first needed to understand what do we know about this system. Generally, we know the threats that migratory songbirds face throughout their life cycle, which these are not the only ones, but mainly could be habitat loss and degradation, collisions, pesticides, and even the poor management of our pets. We also have learned that the breeding period historically has received more studies compared to the non-breeding period. And while this review focused on general animal migration and it only encompassed the years of 1994 to 2012, and yes, I can tell you that in the last 10 years, we have seen an increase in research in migration ecology, there's still this gap likely. So with that, I decided to focus on the ecology of migratory songbirds in the non-breeding region or overwintering phase. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, and I refer to this overwintering period, which is a relatively stationary period where birds are settled in the neotropics. So let me provide an outline for this talk. In the first chapter, I'm going to share with you a systematic review on the overwintering performance of Nearctic Neotropical migratory songbirds. In chapter 2, I evaluate age distribution and performance, so the full overwintering scale. In chapter 3, I will transition to a local scale to the working landscape of Yoro, Honduras, where I explored the landscape context influence on performance of songbirds. And finally, chapter 4 was an exploratory chapter on an understudied topic, which was predation. So with that, let's begin. For chapter 1, the driving question was, what is known about what influences the individual level performance of Nearctic Neotropical migratory songbirds in the overwintering period? Let's remember that the overwintering period is a significant portion of that year, so it can encompass 6 to 8 months. And if we take a look at this conceptual model on the full annual cycle, to understand population limitations, we need to understand population and individual level parameters. And that was the interest for me in this review, is to learn more about what do we know drives individual level parameters of survival and breeding productivity, which are the main individual level parameters of interest to study this topic. I also was interested in learning if we can go deeper from these typical or the main drivers that influence these parameters, which broadly are food, predation, and weather. So before I jump into the review, I want to introduce the term of performance because I'm going to be using it throughout. And performance is an individual level metric that reflects habitat quality. And there are multiple performance metrics that scientists use to measure the habitat quality. But I focused on 2 broad categories throughout the dissertation. One includes physiological indices, such as body condition indices that take measurements of the mass of the individual as well as morphometrics to derive a body condition index. The other category is that of survival, and survival is hard to study, so some proxies to study survival include persistence, how long individuals persist on a site, or quantifying a probability of apparent survival. Okay, so the main objectives of this chapter were to discover what the drivers are that have been studied to date, and then identify knowledge gaps to guide future research. The systematic review process consisted in a systematic search in two databases, two scientific databases, a dissertation database, and what I'm showing here are the different criteria that studies had to fulfill to be considered part of the process. So first, a study had to focus on passeriformes, so songbirds, migratory songbirds. The study had to take place in the Neotropical region. The study had to take place during the non-breeding period. And it had to quantify any of these metrics that I selected as a scoping search, determined that they would likely be those metrics that scientists are measuring for this purpose. So these are the findings. So I found 54 studies that evaluated performance in the overwintering period. Body condition was the most studied metric of the three I evaluated. And the first gap or cluster of knowledge I find is that 58% of songbirds remain unstudied during the non-breeding period. Most studied species, some examples are to the left of three. They belong to the warbler and the thrush family. And then the majority of songbirds have only 1 to 3 studies on performance. We also learned that the most studied places include Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Mexico, Belize, Costa Rica, and Colombia, with more opportunity for studies in other regions. Mainly, the main drivers studied included habitat, food, climate, and sex or age, where sex or age isn't a direct driver, rather it's just a factor considered to, in some studies, to evaluate these other drivers. So with habitat was studied mostly through the lens of habitat type, cover type. Is it mangrove forest? Is it shrub? Is it pine forest, etc. And much less studied in the context of vegetation structural metrics or the landscape surrounding a habitat. Generally, natural habitats, wetter habitats had or influenced performance positively, and body condition was still the most studied relationship to this driver. When it came to food availability, unsurprisingly, generally studies found that higher food availability influenced performance. But what was interesting to learn from food availability studies is that they encompass the experimental studies in this. So there are not many experimental studies. It's hard to control those variables in the field, as you know, not to mention work with protected species. So that was interesting for the food availability studies. And when it came to climate was generally studied through the lens of precipitation. Higher precipitation, again, wetter habitats had a positive influence on performance. And the gap within climate was the study of other metrics, maybe temperature, and also climate change scenarios. We don't have climate change scenarios. For sex or age, we found that not always the case, but some studies found that immatures and females could have a lower performance than adult males. So the knowledge gaps included the following drivers: disease, not studied; predation, barely studied; space use strategy with little studies, where a space use strategy is if an individual is sedentary, maybe territorial, or a floater or wanderer; and interspecific competition in relation to performance as well, understudied. So from this review, what I gained is that there are still species, spatial, and topical gaps that could guide us for studies of interest, especially for a declining group. And what I'm showing here is the bridges of this review to the next chapters of my dissertation. So with age distribution, I will evaluate what do we know about age distribution at the wintering scale, learning about where age groups are can be valuable if one of these age groups is more vulnerable to the population declines. So I was interested in looking at that. Within the landscape context, I mentioned that habitat category that encompasses the habitat type, the landscape was not really studied. And then predation is open for so much research. We don't even know what is the role of predation to non-breeding ecology. So with this transition, I want to talk about chapter 2, where my question was, what drives migratory songbird age distribution, and is it related to overwintering performance? So just as a recap, animal distributions are influenced by different factors. And these factors were also, if you pay attention, also connected to the performance of species and individuals. In 1999, Crystal and collaborators came out with a review that documented the process of differential migration, where different age or sex groups are using different spaces or migrating different timings. And so this is a process that you can observe at that scale. In that review, there were records of immatures of different species beyond songbirds that overwintered farther south. Now, the hypotheses behind these are many. Some include the notions of despotic events, where immatures are subordinate individuals that are pushed to other spaces by adults. And the advantage to that could be that the adults are using areas that have a higher habitat quality, or that in the case of males, they are closer to the breeding region for the subsequent migration season and then establish their territories faster. Another hypothesis would be that the distribution is just random. There's just differential use, but it's random. And it could also mean habitat selection. Different groups are using different habitat types. So, as I mentioned, one of the motivators for studying this is that within the study of population limitations, oftentimes sex and age is an important variable to consider, but understanding the distribution of these different groups is the first step to get to that. And sex segregation has received some attention, and I was interested in age distribution. So with that, I evaluated this hypothesis. In the non-breeding region, habitat selection or despotic events drive age and body condition distribution across the overwintering range. So immature distribution is not random and will be influenced by latitude or elevation. Now, the disclaimer here is that at this scale, teasing apart habitat selection from despotic events is not enough of a resolution. So the main test is whether it is a random distribution or one of these other processes could be at play. The follow-up to that was immatures as the subordinate group would experience lower performance than adults at this scale. So for this work, I focused on 8 migratory songbird species. And I used the data set from the Monitoring Overwintering Survival Program, MoSI for short, spearheaded by the Institute for Bird Populations. This program has been going on since the year 2002. And you can see the distribution of monitoring stations. Now, this program is possible thanks to the effort of hundreds of community partners and volunteers that participate at these stations. I'm showcasing one of my trainers and colleagues, Rosalvi Juarez, in one of the stations close to my hometown, just to show you what goes on and how the data is collected. So birds in the hand, they're caught with mist nets, and data that's collected include morphometric and mass data to derive body condition and disease, or age and sex data. Each individual is marked with an aluminum band in hopes to monitor the population as well. That's the real goal of the full program, but I'm using the data to answer another question. The stations can be found in different types of habitats. Okay, so to evaluate my hypothesis, my response variables were immature proportion in a separate model body condition. I wanted to evaluate those 2 things. And the predictors were elevation, a quadratic term of elevation, to signal that at different elevation bands in the neotropics, you have different climates, different habitat types. And then the second variable of interest was latitude, a quadratic term for latitude, and an interaction between the two. For the second hypothesis, I evaluated if age, immature versus adult, influenced body condition. For body condition, it's just this derived index using the wing chord or wing length and mass. So here are the findings for those 8 species. I found that the main take home from that, right, would be that the distribution of the immatures isn't random, that 7 of 8 species showed a response of immature proportion to elevation, latitude, with a quadratic term signaled by the 2, or an interaction between elevation and latitude. For body condition, we don't get as clear a picture for all of the species throughout. And so only 4 of those species showed a variation of body condition. And then on top of that, when we evaluated body condition with age, we see that it doesn't, age doesn't influence body condition at this scale. So there's a mismatch, you know, at this scale, maybe the body condition difference, well, it's not related to age. I just want to show you a couple of these results more closely to learn about the immature proportion throughout the wintering range. So for these species, there was a range of latitudes that was optimal, represented by this quadratic curve. And we just, you know, discovered that this immature proportion was higher in these latitudes that correspond to stations found in these areas. So we just are giving more resolution to where immature proportion is highest. Now, for those species that showed an interaction, I'm going to use the magnolia warbler as an example. And I'm going to show this heat map of elevation and latitude. Cooler or blue immature proportion tones are areas of lower immature proportion, and yellows are areas of higher immature proportion. So for this species, a higher immature proportion was recorded in lower latitudes, so Nicaragua, Panama, Costa Rica, and mid to high elevations. So we just learned from that where the immatures are. Now, as I mentioned, body condition wasn't a clear signal of, there wasn't a clear signal of how it varied spatially. And if we look at these 2 heat maps, we can see that the areas that have a lower body condition with blue aren't necessarily the same areas where you have the lower immature proportion. Body condition varies spatially, but more needs to be studied to discern why that is. So the take home for this chapter is that, so there is not a random distribution of immatures, but there's more to determine if there is a connection between performance and where the immatures are more numerous. And we found no difference with age. Okay, for now I want to transition from the wintering range to the local scope. Okay, for chapter 3 and 4, I worked within a working landscape of Honduras. My question for chapter 3 was, how does a working landscape influence performance of migratory songbirds? And recall that habitat degradation and loss was one of those main threats for migratory songbirds. It was also one of the most studied drivers of performance. And in Honduras, this habitat change is connected with coffee production. So from 2005 to 2017, this study quantified that from all of the deforestation that takes place in Honduras that is linked to agriculture production, 50% of that is driven by coffee. And when habitats are transformed, here is what a natural habitat can be converted to in terms of coffee. So a farm can be a sun coffee farm where the coffee grows without any overstory, without trees, and it's just basically a monoculture. Farms can be managed as shade coffee farms. So the coffee is growing under the shade of trees. And if we're thinking of the farm as this management unit, then we can think of a farm that combines all of these types of systems in a land-sparing approach, where you have a coffee crop, which may be not as visible here, but it's to the left. And then in the same property, you have a patch of forest or regenerating area in it. And in Honduras, our collaborators, the Mesoamerican Development Institute, have turned this land-sparing approach interconnected open canopy, or IOC for short, which is what they use to manage these areas within the Department of Europe. So we know that migratory songbirds can subsist in shade coffee farms. There have been many studies that quantify the diversity, the community, the species richness of migratory songbirds. Beyond that, we have studies that have evaluated the value of shade coffee as a habitat for migratory songbirds, but results are mixed. And they vary by species, maybe by location. So some studies find that songbirds that overwinter in shade coffee farms can increase their body condition in the winter. In the same study, they also found species that didn't see a response to shade coffee, or that even had showed a decline of body condition throughout the winter in shade coffee. We also have studies that have compared the value of forest and shade coffee. And the findings suggest that while forest still has this higher intrinsic quality for the birds, shade coffee can be valuable for some performance metrics because they're comparable between the two systems. And then in our study area in Honduras, a study found that the wood thrush survival rate was lower in heavily shaded coffee farms. So we have a mixture. All of these studies were conducted at the site level. So with this work in this chapter, I will contribute by looking at the landscape context and its influence on performance. My hypothesis is forest loss and degradation reflected in the landscape influences performance of individuals during the overwintering season and could contribute to population limitation. We did this work in 18 coffee farms in the Department of Yoro, Honduras for 2 field seasons. I already described these different management systems. Within or for each of these study sites, we characterize the surrounding landscape of circa 20 hectares in extent. And within those landscapes, we classify the types of cover that can be found. And in Yoro, that includes forest, shade coffee, non-habitat, and sun coffee. What I mean by non-habitat are land uses that include cornfields, pasture lands for cattle, areas that local species aren't going to be using as their habitat. Within those landscapes, we also quantified a metric of edge density that reflects the level of partitioning that you see in a landscape or interruption. So because these, I'm interested in the landscape as a whole and characterizing that landscape, all of these metrics were combined in a principal component analysis that characterizes the landscape of Europe. And that principal component resulted in 2 composite variables. The first variable expresses or shows a gradient from non-habitat to shade coffee. And the second component is reflecting a gradient from high forest with high edge density to shade coffee. This is a bird's eye view. And what I want you to appreciate is that the landscape varies so much that when you use a variable like shade coffee or forest, you may be losing some information on how it really, on the surrounding land. Okay, I focused on 2 species for this one, the Wilson's warbler and the wood thrush. And okay, I do want to say that the techniques used to study these birds is adapted from the MoSI program. So we caught these individuals, we collected morphometrics and mass to obtain a body condition index. In the second field season, I conducted a study on apparent survival, and that required capturing those individuals, color marking them, and conducting reciting surveys to observe, to create a detection history of these individuals, hopefully being lucky of finding those individuals. and being able to quantify the probability of apparent survival. We call it apparent survival because with these techniques, we cannot tease apart mortality from emigration. So it's just this, it's the best that we can do. Okay, so our response variables for the modeling framework were apparent survival of body conditions separately. And for this chapter, I ran two sets of models. One was a model that evaluated the site context. So let's evaluate first if IOC, sun coffee, shade coffee has an influence on these performance metrics. I also used ordinal date and season just to account for possible changes throughout the season. The second phase was the landscape context modeling phase and included the modeling of the landscape context variable against these performance metrics. Okay, so now to what I found. So for Wilson warbler, interesting to us was that the sample population was mostly male and mostly juvenile. So I think that this will tell us also something about how we interpret these results in light of this population of immature, sorry, not juveniles. And we found evidence for site and landscape influence on body condition and apparent survival. For the wood thrush, we didn't find evidence suggested by our models that site or landscape influenced body condition. And we learned that this color banding reciting method was not good. A good use for this cryptic species that uses the forest floor. Okay, so let me just go into more detail on the results for the Wilson warbler. On the y-axis, you have SMI, which means scaled mass index, which is our body condition index. And the model indicates that there was a higher body condition in the shade system than in the IOC system, where there's this land-sparing approach. Survival wasn't different, and we had a high variation for shade, likely because of our sample when we just look at survival in the one field season. For the landscape context, before I share the results, I want to remind you that we have these landscapes that go from a lot of forest and a lot of partitioning in the landscape to less partitioning or edge density and more shade cover. And so we found opposing responses from our performance variables. For scale mass index, our body condition index, that index was higher in landscapes with higher shade and then lower in landscapes of higher forest. But survival was the opposite. It increased with high forest and high edge density. So this just teaches us how important, first of all, and I'm not the first person to say this, it is to measure more than one metric of performance, and also the complexities that can happen when you study the songbird ecology. So we have three interpretations of these results. One alternative is that shade and forest in this landscape are complementary habitats. They are positively influencing at some point these two measures. The second interpretation has to do with the quality of the apparent survival, where it can mean emigration rather than true survival. And so shade coffee in this alternative has a value that allows birds to increase their body condition, but then low apparent survival means higher immigration. And we did try to model this, but we had some conversion issues adding date to the survival models specifically. But we have another alternative too. Once again, for body conditions, shade coffee farms can have this positive influence, but maybe survival is actually lower. And because of many reasons, including predation, which is under study, and I will discuss a little bit more in the next set of slides. But first, I want to leave you with the take home of this chapter, which is how we have such an opportunity with the landscape context and performance, especially for birds in the overwintering region, because it can add to our knowledge on management in that region. Okay. So, Okay, so the last chapter was an exploratory chapter, and it was new in many ways for me. The question of this chapter was, how does perceived predation risk influence overwintering ecology of migratory songbirds? So the obvious effects of predation on individuals is mortality, and then that's natural in ecology. But there are also non-lethal effects that predation can have on populations that wildlife biologists are trying to get out there. Again, like we need to understand these non-lethal effects too for several animal species. So I studied perceived predation risk, which I define here is the perceived likelihood of a prey animal being killed by a predator. So habitats can vary in their risk amount. An open habitat for a species that needs to hide from a predator is more risky than a habitat that's more complex in structure. And vice versa for a species that requires vigilance and being aware of the surroundings, an obstructive habitat is more risky than the more open one. So that is the concept of predation risk. It can vary because of the habitat quality and the predator's density, distribution, etc. Now, the perception part is the cues that the individuals receive from the landscape that maybe from learned experiences suggest this is a risky landscape. Again, experiences like in this open habitat, I was almost depredated on. Or cues, oral cues like songs of predators, calls of predators. So 2 ways to measure perceived predation risk include quantifying behavioral responses, and in birds, the predator inspection or mobbing response is used to monitor the birds and also to study their response. So a mobbing response consists of several individuals and species observing a predator, becoming alert, emitting calls, even striking the predator maybe, and getting closer up on the predator. Predation of the predator avoidance is also a metric, but we're not going to focus on that here. The other way to evaluate perceived predation risk is understanding co-occurrence of predator and prey, so distribution metrics. For migratory songbirds in the non-breeding grounds, recall that that was one of the understudied topics of the full review. And we just have anecdotes. Within all of these papers, I would just find anecdotes of, oh, one individual was eaten by a rat, by a falcon, a predator. And so most of what we know is anecdotal. Now, because I was so interested in what happens in working landscapes, maybe the working landscapes not only influence the function of a habitat for food availability, but maybe they make it a more risky place. So the hypothesis was working landscapes influence the perceived predation risk for overwintering migratory songbirds. For this chapter, I do not focus on performance. I'm mostly focusing on population response and community response. So I had 2 data sets to work with for this chapter. One was a data set collected by our collaborators in 2016, consisting of point counts, which are counts that record all of the species that are found within a determined amount of time. And this data set consisted on 30 points that were in forests in Yoro, Honduras, and 22 that were found in coffee. From this data set, I extracted occurrences of a known avian predator in the region and for birds, the ferruginous pygmy owl, and occurrences of all the migratory songbirds for a total of 12. With this data set, I built a hierarchical model for species communities, which first evaluates if the occurrence of each species separately is influenced by environmental factors or this environmental filtering. And in our case, we were interested in forest or coffee. Then from these models, we can also generate a correlation matrix that indicates if two individuals are likely to occur or not in the same area. So for predator-prey, we would expect, we predicted that we were going to have a negative correlation between the migratory songbirds and the ferruginous pygmy owl. Okay, so this was the modeling of the first data set. With this, I'll extract a distribution metric of co-occurrence. The second data set consisted of data from a trial I conducted during my first field season in Honduras, where I used the playback of the ferruginous pygmy owl, and then within a 10-meter radius, I recorded number of individual songbirds that approached the playback, number of species, latency, which is how fast they would respond to this cue, and the minimum distance of any given individual response to this. This became these variables, then I pulled them into one composite anti-predator response. And during my field season, I had, again, this data farm management system, owl detection, and trial numbers. So we conducted repeated trials, and we wanted to account for this possibility that with more playback, maybe there's a lower response. And then a second model where, again, I used those landscape context variables from the previous chapter, but on top of that, for the sites where I did the trial, which were a subset of 10, I had vegetation structure data like tree height, basal area. So I merged them all into a principal component, and each of these is a working landscape attribute. So to the findings. From the hierarchical modeling of the species communities, we learned that in relation to coffee, species have this negative occurrence with forest. In fact, most of these posterior means are negatively related to forest cover, meaning most occur in coffee. Even the ferruginous pygmy owl has this mean more towards coffee, but we can see that the species uses the two habitats more. Now I'm going to show you the correlation matrix. So we have the species on the y-axis, and then just a shorthand for each of these species on the x-axis. The circles that you're going to see, if they are red and positive, being a positive co-occurrence, and negative and blue means negative co-occurrence. So you'll see something like this. And here's what we found. So generally, the songbirds had a negative co-occurrence with this known avian predator, but we only found that there was statistical support at the 75% level for these 5 species. And we do see, as a secondary result, as expected, the songbirds are co-occurring. You know, they have the behaviors such as flocking. That is just like a secondary aspect of this analysis. Now I'm going to show you the responses of the anti-predator. So the mobbing trial with the playback. This is just a summary of what happened with those mobbing trials. So across trials, 16 songbirds responded. The most responsive species were the magnolia warbler and the Wilson's warbler. And the averages just show, on average, on these mobbing trials, what was the mean species number, mean individuals, mean minimum distance, etc. With these metrics from the mean species to mean latency, I built the composite variable, and this is just that response. More individuals and more species respond to lower distances and faster. That is concordant to the literature of an anti-predator response. With the models, we found no evidence, however, that the farm management system or that the landscape and vegetation metrics influenced this anti-predator response or mobbing response. So we have one result and then one that we didn't find evidence for. So one way I'm interpreting this response is that you can interpret the anti-predator response as there's just a homogeneous response. So there wasn't a difference between the landscape, but we don't really have a comparison with another area that is mostly forested throughout to maybe see the difference. Another research has suggested that mobbing intensity increases depending on the habitat and where you have more owls. This research was conducted in Costa Rica. So maybe the anti-predator response shows us that it's homogeneous, the landscape is risk. And our co-occurrence results would suggest that that is the case. But I think that this predation topic just requires more studies. Okay. So let me just walk through some main take homes for the full dissertation. So in chapter 1, I learned that there are still spatial, species, and topical gaps to understand the performance of migratory songbirds that will be necessary for modeling full annual cycle demographics. In chapter 2, the main take home was that age distribution wasn't random, but it requires more study to determine there is a link between performance or even exploring other hypotheses of where we may see a difference in immature proportion at this scale. From chapter 3, I learned that the landscape context can inform how birds are sustained in their overwintering habitats. And from chapter 4, that there are still basic gaps in ecology that are missing. So the value I want to highlight is that those anecdotal evidence, those natural history tidbits that you find in some studies can still be very, very important to guide future research. And I think that throughout, personally, what I learned from my dissertation is that this is a system that is well studied, you would argue, but evaluating knowledge gaps constantly or every so often is important, especially for researchers that don't know what to study. It's a good starting point. Okay, I want to take some time to thank my family, every mentor I've had that I remember since my undergraduate, everyone on Zoom, thank you, and all of you, the department, for being here and making this a not so bad experience. So I will take it. Yeah, sure, but I'm fine.
Thank you. Excellent job.
Okay.
So I was struck by one of the maps where you showed the distribution of, I don't know, one songbird species of multiple in the overwintering area. And
The first one you mean?
Yeah, and it doesn't matter, but what you said was that in the age analysis, the younger birds, the more immature birds were in lower latitudes. And that males were at higher latitudes. Is that a real?
Yes and no. So one of the things we learned, so the question is if immatures were at lower latitudes and then males were at higher, it varies because the two things, age and sex, can obviously interplay. What we learned from this initial review is that for some species, it could be the other way around too. So there's just, it's not a, people, researchers say that this is a convergence trait. It's like the differential migration and how it goes can just be different depending on this. And I didn't look at sex. I was mostly interested in age, but yeah, so it depends.
Well, one of the things that just quick follow up, one of the things that I was struck by was if the more southern latitude kind of forced the immatures into an area that would be less, more northern parts of central America in particular, bigger area, and I would assume is there any possibility that
So if on Zoom, I'm just going to repeat briefly, the question is if there is differential migration or differential use, maybe where those groups are pushed, there could be different pressures in habitat. And yes, so in the sex segregation literature, I have a colleague that studied that and found that through her review, there's evidence for females to use lower elevation habitats that may have higher pressure to deforestation. So yes, that's the connection to why we want to learn about this in relation to population limitations, is to understand the distribution and see if there are different pressures of the groups.
Thank you.
Do you know if there are like other species that people study that also migrate and like look at similar things like body exhibition or performance? What do they say?
Migrate in what sense?
Like, I don't know, like migrating bats or migrating butterflies.
Oh, right. You know, I'm not sure I know exactly, because I know that the migratory systems for sure involve this full annual cycle approach for turtles, etc. But I would imagine that every study system has a bias in one way or another, depending on where your resources are to study, or maybe some topics are harder to study, harder to document, maybe with systems like monarch butterflies. I can imagine that it gets hard to study some aspects of the biology. So, yeah. I see a question over here.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, has anyone studied the differences in like differential migration across like different trophic guilds with these birds? Like maybe.
So the question is, if differential migration has been studied across like trophic guilds. No, not that I found. The food is definitely one of the things that is one of the big drivers of, of survival in all of these systems. But no, I don't think that has been studied.
Questions from Zoom?
Yes, we have one from Oliver Comer.
Oh, okay.
He says that he wonders if accipiter abundance and density varies among farm types. Accipiters may also be native.
Yes. So in this data set that we had of questions, the detection of accipiters and other avian predators was very low. The ferruginous pygmy was the most detected, so it also makes it easier to study that. But yes, and I have also seen forest falcons, which makes it a little harder in the forested region. They're more cryptic, but also going after birds. So I think that touches on an interesting thing where even with the predation topic, a first study on documenting what the potential predators are is going to be valuable.
There's another.
I was wondering with the comparing the different land use types, how much do these birds move around? And when you're measuring a particular response in that spot, how likely is it that it's actually a response to that spot?
Yeah. So two things, they definitely move, and we have some radio tracking data that indicate how much they move. In Honduras and in our study site, with the wood thrush study conducted in 2012, we learned some of the mean movements, like how many meters. It was like roughly a mean of 180 meters that a given bird could move. And that dictated the size of that circle. So with that, I tried to mitigate this. We're counting on the performance that's reflected at this scale. For the habitat, there's not really, other than some of the Wilson's warblers and birds are territorial. So you know that they are using those areas. So you have to mitigate that. You have to maybe know the species, but yeah.
Another question?
Yeah, from Theorizana asked for excellent work, and all the findings are important, but if you had to choose one of them that contributes the most to the advancement of science, what would it be?
Wow, I think that that's a good question.
You want to hear the question?
I hope so. He said that if I had to pick one of the chapters that contributed more to advancing the science, I'm going to reduce it to advancing the field. Because we're in this department where people are doing such great things, it's hard to say that. But I'm torn between two things. One, my systematic review showed me so much about knowledge clusters and knowledge gaps. And I think that they're so valuable in an age where we're producing research, but are we synthesizing that research to know if we're answering those big questions? So that's, to me, it's one of the most valuable. And the other one would be the, okay. So the fourth chapter, I think, is expanding a frontier of study with predation, which is hard to study, and that's why likely it's not studied. In fact, we wanted to track pygmy owls at some point, but we didn't get grant money to do it. But I think that that's important. But I'll cheat and I'll answer another thing. I think that beyond the science, chapter 3 with the landscape context is the one that I value most for conservation. Because in the ornithological conservation world, we are talking about, or community partners are talking about how to conserve spaces across the wintering range. And if you're just looking at the sites and not the landscape, we're adding this level of what you can look at to guide those strategies. So.
You might have sort of just answered my question.
Okay.
You did such a fabulous job, first of all. But I was wondering how you'll translate this to farmers.
Yeah, that's, I think that to farmers, it has, I'm not in Honduras anymore, but through the coffee project, I've had a good experience in being in the system and working with the different people. And I'm sure that we're going to use this data within our group to discuss and see what we can do with it. And then it just kind of goes down. I mean, I still am in contact with some people, but I also think that to speak of the things I learned from them, some farmers value birds, and they're also thinking more about the system as a whole. They're thinking more about this forest gives me water, this forest gives me things. And that has kind of flipped a little my idea of, the lens at which I'm studying this, for the bird ecology, but into maybe like, let's flip it and like, how do you study it from the lens of what they value? And I think that that's something that, they're trying to assess and learn too.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I think we need to get out of this room by 12 o'clock, so that's a good place to. Thank you.